Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Librarian archives dedicated to conversations on the evolution of multilateralism. And today we have with us Dr. Martin Wählisch, who is the inaugural Associate Professor of Transformative Technologies, Innovation and Global Affairs at the University of Birmingham,
yeah,
in
thanks
the UK.
for having me.
Yes. His work explores how emerging technologies and futures thinking can advance international relations and enhance peace processes and drive sustainable development. So with that, Martin, perhaps you could introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us what you've been working on since you last spoke on the podcast, which was about topics around AI and multilateralism last year.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Amy. Look, I'm focusing currently on geopolitical aspects of artificial intelligence, especially the race between the United States and China. We're trying to kind of disentangle this race to better understand how this polarity between those two superpowers can be defined based on kind of compute power, talent, access to technology, and so forth. I think that's an interesting aspect, which is reshaping geopolitical dynamics as we speak. And then more on the computational side, I'm still very passionate about deliberation processes and how AI can help to build empathic chatbots that help one unpack complex political issues in order to forge consensus between nations, but also between communities on a smaller scale.
How interesting. You said empathetic.
Yeah.
How would you bring that into AI?
Yeah. So like all of us probably feel this frustration when we try to annul a credit card charged and we call the hotline. And, in the past it was, press 0 for cancellation and 1 for losing your sanity, basically. And then I see myself usually still in 2025 shouting into the phone, customer service. And the systems are getting better to catch kind of the human voice, right? And we've seen robocalls where it's very hard to say, am I talking to a real person? Am I talking to a deep fake? And we have seen this being used for political action as well, where politicians were called by other politicians that weren't the real politicians. But what I'm interested in is how can we have this to enable a conversation, self-conversation about very complex matters. So imagine you have an AI-powered system that feels like a good friend, like a mixture of a very smart therapist, friend, but also teacher, mentor, and that picks up on not just what you say, but also tonality, like how you say things, right? And we've seen some interesting experiments over the last 12 months, which show that there is a recalibration of how humans interact with machines. There's an experiment that was done in the United States in October last year where they wanted to see whether psychologists can outperform ChatGPT or ChatGPT can rather outperform psychologists in identifying emotions. And they saw that ChatGPT, off-the-shelf kind of foundational model was more accurate in identifying the emotions of the participants that were explaining how they feel. So accuracy was higher. But then, and that's more interesting, they asked about satisfaction. Are people more comfortable talking with machines than with humans? And that experiment, North American demographic might be, different in a different cultural context. 82% said that they felt more comfortable talking to the machine. And that's interesting. And when they asked them why did you feel more comfortable? People say, I didn't feel judged. Didn't feel judged as much as I would feel judged when I'm talking about intimate or difficult issues to a friend or psychologist. I also felt the machine could listen endlessly to me. Right? A capacity that, has some limitations. Think about how long you can listen to your partner, to your best friend. And then, also the participant in that experiment said, look, we felt that everything could be forgotten by the machine much more than by a human. So that we're going towards a future where the technology is not just becoming more human-like, but opens up new additional opportunities to have conversations, learn about oneself, but then also forge consensus and build greater peace.
That's really interesting. I would have certainly guessed on the confidentiality side, but this idea of non-judgment surprises me a little.
Yeah, and there's definitely a risk, right, in all of this. All of this technology that we're looking at the University of Birmingham for peace can be used for the dark side as well, right? There's always this dual aspect of technology, dual-use technology. We talk about this at length in military and defense studies. But what we are curious about is, and given that there's a heavy investment on intelligence and security, how can we repurpose this to enable human contact? How can we repurpose this to forge greater consensus?
Fascinating. But today we're talking slightly different areas. We're going to be talking about futures thinking and also about science fiction, which is something I know very, very little about. So I'm very interested to hear more about what you've got to say. I was thinking about strategic foresight and how it's becoming essential for multilateral organizations. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, when you look into the reform agenda of the United Nations framed under the UN 2.0 umbrella and in the quintet of change, which has data, digital transformation, behavior science, and then innovation, and then lastly, the fifth element is strategic foresight. One sees, a moment where at least the UN and probably also other organizations are putting greater emphasis on how can we tame uncertainty and how can we enable organizations to become more future-proof. Now, what does that mean? Let's unpack that for a second. Let's unpack this historically. I put my professorial hat on, basically. Strategic foresight has been around for a long time. It's part of military planning. If you look into the history of the terminology, it has emerged strongly on the UK side because the military assumptions of whether or not the Germans would bomb London were contradicting what happened. There was an optimism that the Nazis wouldn't really attack the UK island, so to say. And that led to forecasting, so data-driven prediction systems, but then also foresighting, which it can be data-driven, but also has other methods to get more comfortable about uncertainties. So what are those methods I'm talking about? Forecasting and data-driven forecasting could be one element of that. Or surveys, for instance, right, is a very common tool for foresight exercises. You ask a bunch of people, hope you have statistical relevance, so you get a sense for how things go. Though people change their mind, it's not really super accurate. You have the Delphi method. You ask like Oracle of Delphi. You ask experts, right? You hope that the bright and the smart will give you the wisdom. And then there's speculative design, where you start stepping away from what you could see in the data, what you could see in kind of the logical trajectories that might be at the horizon, and you start speculating. So you throw first everything overboard which you believe in, right? And then you start playing with what's left or what could emerge from that. And science fiction is one element of that, to basically build worlds in the future that help you calibrate what a desired future could look like, or a not desirable future. Like a lot of the science fiction we see, that is consumed on Netflix and so forth is dystopian future. Things like, end of the world, pandemic, things you don't want to see, but then there's usually an ideal case. Ideal, I say, at least for the preference of science fiction I enjoy. Some might have more dark side enjoy, kind of the end of the world scenario on a daily basis. There's an hero emerging, and then there are lessons learned from that to be drawn. And we have seen again and again that science fiction, bears an opportunity to think about new devices, new technologies that then slowly but surely, become part of the real world. Think about the iPad, very much present in Star Trek, or let's just stay with Star Trek, like talking to a machine, right, instructing to a machine. But also think about kind of private space travel, right, which seemed a bit distant 20 years ago and now is just a question of the size of a bank account.
Exactly. So could you give us perhaps an example then when futures thinking has already influenced multilateral policy?
Yeah. So I feel that, what's happening in the General Assembly, just stay with one of the, 6 organs of the United Nations, is a constant foresight exercise. If you look at the general debate happening in September over the 1 or 2 weeks in New York, those are big futuring exercises where member states articulate what their priorities are now and what the priorities are that they see at the horizon and where they would like to see international consensus on. So I think, it's not called like that, but like the general debates are big futuring exercises. You see the same with regard to certain settings of the Security Council that look at prevention issues where, signals at the horizon are scanned, and those are futuring exercises. And then obviously you have big planning exercises when it comes to kind of adjusting collaboration frameworks between the United Nations and member states, or on substantial issues like scientific issues, outer space exploration, technology. Think about what's happening across the street at ITU, thinking about regulation for issues that might bear risk, including artificial intelligence or biotech or quantum and so forth. So those are examples where futuring is happening or foresighting is happening. And I use kind of the active word of that without being labeled as such. Now, separately from that, We have seen dedicated efforts in the peace and security context, again, mostly driven by military actors. Let me give you 2 examples. One is the Mad Scientist Initiative of the United States Army. The French Army has a similar initiative, which they call the Red Team, where they bring together science fiction authors and so forth. Now, I've seen other member states kind of embracing kind of this creative aspect of prototyping and creative thinking to think about, the future of warfare. And that has informed strategies. And slowly but surely we have seen this on the similar end within foreign ministries, but there's still a lot of hesitation.
So what type of skills and mindset do diplomats need to develop to be thinking in this way?
Right. So I think that foresight and futuring is somehow kind of the opposite of what diplomatic training usually entails, which is about being risk averse and conservative because of the magnitude of decisions that are made through diplomatic negotiations and the gravity of impact that, kind of treaties bear. Because once a treaty is signed, it takes sometimes years, decades to accomplish. It's going to stay in place for a long time. This is not a fast track business. So that's why there's a lot of caution to be creative. There's a lot of caution to question the status quo. Now, that said, creative decision-making requires to think out of the box, and that's where futures thinking comes in. Also, let me give you some examples here. First one, there's not just one future. There are various futures. There's a desirable future and an unwanted future. There's a likely future and an unlikely future. So what diplomats require, I think, at least that has helped me, having worked in that field, is to become futures literate. And UNESCO has been running different futures literacy programs with schools, but also higher education entities and member states to make decision makers or upcoming decision makers or current decision makers future proof. So to have that understanding that, number one, there are multiple futures. Number two, nobody can predict the future depending on your religious and value background, might have a different belief. And then 13, we use this in peace building that everybody can shape their own future. In an ideal case, right? If you are kind of in a situation where you are, constrained with resources or, kept hostage in your social system, that might not feel like it. But still, even then, we have seen revolutions and uprising, to realize that people can shape their future. So all of those aspects that I'm just describing now, and on top of that, the kind of method of experimentation and speculative design gives you a skill set, right, to come up with future-proofing of policy decisions and not to end up with what's usually happening, looking at the best, the worst case, and the medium case scenario, because there are a lot of shades in between.
Exactly. It also takes a lot of openness.
Yeah, and it's always a question of character as well, right? I mean,
yes.
We all start as children. And if you look at kind of education studies, the element of play is an important one of learning. We learn with our hands, not just things we grab, but also things we put together or we tear apart, right? And then that element of exploration is inherently, I think, part of our life journey. Again, there are more grumpy characters that also end up being diplomats. And then there are those who are explorers. I think the diplomatic field lends itself to being an explorer because you're often thrown to different places in the world, right? And I think it's kind of a natural way of exploring what holds us together or tears us apart. But one needs to make space for that. I think that's an important element. I think that's why kind of the call of the current Secretary General for kind of foresight as being part of the UN skill set, but also we've seen this during the pandemic, member states or private sector companies, kind of turning to foresight and futuring exercises to make sure that they are not missing out on the next technological leap, for instance. Think about the oil and gas industry. Shell invested heavily into foresight, in the past because they didn't really foresee the environment or didn't want to foresee the environment impact. Or think about the German automobile industry at the moment that is still holding on to the belief that electric cars is something for the distant future. Kind of, this utility is very much seen on the private sector side because it keeps one on its toes and it makes one fit for purpose. And that's why it's equally relevant for public institutions.
Yeah, it's very relevant, very practical. So we may be talking about sci-fi, but it's extremely relevant. Yes. I noted whilst reading a little bit about this and preparing that actually in 1963, the ITU Secretary General Gerald Gross said something quite interesting in a statement talking about outer space at the UN Conference on Science and Technology for Development. And he said that the science fiction dreams of former years have become the urgent emergent reality of today. And that was in 1963. So today, I think we really do see all of that and so much more projecting forward. How do you think science fiction can really inspire diplomats and international organizations right now?
Yeah, and first, bravo, Amy, for digging this out from the archives. I mean, only a podcast hosted by the UN Archives in Geneva can give us a quote like that. So thank you. I will steal that for other presentations. So thank you for that. Look, I mentioned already strategic planning, right? This is like where the most obvious way of how foresight is part of the game. That's why often, us as practitioners, we talk about strategic foresight, and you see different terminology. There's foresight in capital letters, strategic foresight in capital letters. I use the word futuring, right? It's also used because it includes other methods. Again, scenario planning is one of the most common one for strategic foresight exercises. One method that I'm very passionate about is participatory foresight. So when you do crowdsourcing on certain solutions in order to challenge your beliefs, right? And we've seen this in large-scale planning processes. I remember this as part of the UN survey for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. We're celebrating 80 years this year. Well, I haven't seen a survey for this year, but 5 years ago, there was a survey which was a big futuring exercise to hear what people have to say. And I think a million or plus participate. I'm not sure about the numbers. Somebody has to look that up. But that was definitely a way to have a participatory approach to future planning. And other means to bring in voices that are not part of the regular conversation, I think, have proven to be helpful in coming up with assumptions or sharpening assumptions that might lead to decisions that won't carry long. And I think that's all helpful, especially at the time where there's so much perceived uncertainty, right? Volatility because of the economic situation, security, world politics, that feels all very frightening. We've been just through this with the pandemic. That's why foresight has also seen kind of revamped during the pandemic, or will face something certainly now. I think all of this is helpful just to get more at ease with uncertainty, right? It's just about training this muscle a bit more. So that's why it's high time to invest time and energy into becoming literate on the future.
What do you think it adds more than other methods?
In terms of foresight in particular?
Yes.
Look, I just ended with saying that's kind of a muscle. It's also probably how you perceive kind of what's lying ahead of you, right? Because if you can't foresee what's ahead of you or like behind the curve, so to say, and life is usually not a straight trajectory where you could, kind of see what's happening in 2030 is usually kind of a maze. It gives some kind of psychological relief and an opportunity to respond to this uncertainty that might unfold, with different pathways at a higher speed. So I think that's kind of, it's preparedness eventually, getting more comfortable with uncertainty and preparedness. And I'm very aware, and you hear this in my accent, that I'm German, there's a cultural issue as well. There's some cultures that you're constantly at unease with uncertainty, and there are others that are more relaxed about it. So definitely there's kind of, this is definitely a tool that has been predominantly used in the global North and West, where people are very uncomfortable with things they can't see. I've lived in places in the world where this is just embraced, so futuring and foresight is just like a very different style in other parts of the world. And one needs to have a conversation about this as well, because there's a lot of critique with regard to the foresight method that we promote and that we use.
Interesting. What would be the major critique?
The major critique is that there's a linear pathway, right, that one can tame by better understanding where the curves are in the maze. Some say that, things will always be unpredictable. Even the weather forecast on the same day is not accurate. So why waste time and energy on that? Let's just be more chilled about it, let's just relax and solve this situation right then and here. And think about it, you have been probably part of workshops and seminars organized by colleagues from different cultures. Some plan a month in advance, some plan a week in advance, and some plan on the spot, right? And think about how you handle situations where things don't go as planned, right? How much anxiety that creates, how much your body is then unease, and how your decisions are impacted by that unease. While if you have the mental state of mind that this could be going into anyway, this could, create other opportunities. Now, that said, I believe totally in preparedness, right? Because often we are just driven by this intuition, like preparedness that comes from the inside because of experience and so forth. But the matters that are dealt with in the international theater, which are really about war and peace, they shouldn't be left just to a gut feeling. They shouldn't be just left to laissez-faire, or let's just see what happens. It's just too high stakes. And on top of that, the different cultural ways of how to tame the future work if one is in a certain regional setting, but on a global setting, one needs to find a way to address this through kind of a common methodology. I hope that makes sense somehow.
It does. It does. Yes. I'm also interested in how much you're speaking about human psychology in this.
Yeah. Look, I'm not a psychologist. I can just read up on it and talk to colleagues who are covering this. And again, kind of anxiety is a big part of us, and it shapes our behavior. We can train for that. So that's why, again, a method of foresight is to run simulations. So not just kind of scenario planning, but simulations where we throw people into those situations. I think the model United Nations that many of us were part of is this, to prepare us for future leadership. And you would be surprised how many diplomats were part of those exercises in the past. But we run the same with regard to simulations of negotiations, right? Or difficult peace negotiations, right? Where we kind of recreate the setting, play the devil's advocate, or put ourselves into the shoes of the other, just to, again, anticipate, foresee what could be certain moves in order then on the spot be ready to make a decision when the time is very short to make a decision.
So coming back a little to science fiction, somehow quite often that sounds so unreal, so exaggerated. How do you keep it anchored in reality when you're visioning in such a way? Or do you think that science fiction actually helps ground us by revealing hidden assumptions?
Yeah, probably a bit of both of that, Look, number one, the future is very ordinary. And that's why most of the science fiction we see is rooted in kind of what's happening around us. And that's very different from fantasy, right? So here, like, just to explain the difference to the audience in this podcast, there's difference between science fiction and fantasy. Fantasy would be the unicorn, completely different world. And science fiction is the world of us, but in the future projected. So there will be a chair, there will be a table. There's even a bathroom in Star Trek. I never see them use the toilet, but they wash their hands and they order tea and what have you. So like this is a way where we can be more addressed in the present to see that the future will be pretty much the past, And you just told me about the renovation that is going to happen here, that hasn't happened for a long, long time in the archives in Geneva. So, and I'm sure, as you told me, that the bookshelves are going to hopefully stay the same if nothing happens, knock on wood, that the future is inspired by the past. We're also collectors, right? I mean, I have two little kids. If we're at the beach or at a holiday, like they grab thousands of things with them because it holds our memory. It's a representation. It's an artifact of a memory that we want to keep somehow, and a physical representation of that is important. And then those things are getting handed from one side to the other. Think about jewelry or property and what have you. So the future and science fiction is always inspired by the past. Now, there are two trajectories this can go, right? Dystopian or utopian future. Now, bad news are good news. So most of the kind of exciting science fiction that sees a lot of positive response from audience is dystopian, because then you can build in this moment of suspense where a hero emerges and solves the riddle, right? This just has to do with the mechanics of drama. It's not just science fiction. It has to do with, you have this in advertisement or elsewhere. But there's a preference. So I've seen a lot of solar punk emerging over the last years, which draw from kind of thinking around the role of nature and sustainability, right? So looking at how can we preserve the planet, not just destroy it, not just this dystopian future where the machines take over, but where we're more in harmony with the planet. So that's more kind of utopian future and sustainable issues. So solar punk has emerged in that regard, and then many aspects. I've been working on a few short stories in that context. I'm happy to share more about this as well.
Oh, we'd love to hear more about that. We'll have to put that in the notes. You briefly touched on things earlier about bringing in different voices and talking also about different cultures and the way they deal with uncertainty and planning and so on. And so I was also wondering how multilateral processes can ensure that diverse voices and perspectives are included when we are imagining possible futures.
Yeah. So in an ideal case, we have participatory processes, right? And those are not just kind of selective voices that serve as an alibi, right? So we can check the box, but like we have large-scale consultation processes, and even the process of the foresight exercise would be participatory. So one decides on the process because I go back to kind of colonializing future, just by using certain methods, we can already kind of pre-frame the outcome. We just define a room where people can participate, but, this is just a sideshow and far away from the decision-making table. So ideally, we have participatory processes that are part of the design process as well. And this can take all forms and shapes. This can be workshops, this can be big surveys, this could be speculative exercises, where one calls for artifacts of the future that, help one reimagine how political, economic, social issues could play out, and so forth. Like creative writing exercises, right? Again, I think in the best case to move beyond kind of traditional foresight tools, which are scenario planning, best case, worst case, medium case scenario, but like a more colorful way of taming this beast of uncertainty.
So if you're talking about science fiction, using science fiction in sort of UN things. But there's also the other way around. I was reading a blog post that you'd written, and you mentioned that the UN has actually appeared in some science fiction films. So would you tell us about that? It was the UN General Assembly Hall, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. So you're alluding to Transformers 3, which is the Dark Side of the Moon, third part. I'm talking about the Marvel version here, Hollywood movie released in 2011. And the funny thing is, although parts so maybe on the backstory, I'm not sure whether the audience is fully familiar with Transformers, right? So Transformers, where you have Decepticons and the Autobots. So, they come from a planet, Cybertron called, and these are kind of AI-powered or kind of technology-powered machines that are in war with each other. They're living on that planet, and then there's a war, so the Autobots have to leave the planet. And there's a spacecraft that escapes with a secret weapon and crashes on the moon, but on the dark side of the moon. NASA discovers that, and under Kennedy, they launch Apollo 11 to have that spacecraft recovered. And when there is kind of a 20-minute or 50-minute blackout because of the Earth rotation, this is the moment where they grab the elements from the spaceship, bring it to Earth. And here comes the UN. The UN then grants later on the Autobots refugee status on Earth in return to getting their support to solve conflicts on Earth. And there is a deviation between the movie and the comic series and, the physical hard version comic as well. In the movie, and that's really interesting, so Transformers 3, they filmed in the UN General Assembly Hall for this part, but it was never used in the actual movie. It's like kind of a typical thing where you think like, the UN should be part of that. They didn't use it in the final cut, actually. But in the...
I'm so disappointed now.
So big bummer. I shouldn't have said that. So otherwise, we're all drawn to this. But, and here comes the twist. The UN appears in various versions of the comic series. So the kind of the animation series, so to say, right? And also in the comic books. So just to say, a little bit, but I'm just dismissing Hollywood here. Although the third one is a good one, that part wasn't actually used. But what we learned from Transformers and the other good science fiction series that use the UN as a reference is that the UN and Transformers use as a placeholder. And if you watch the series for international global governance, doesn't always help the Autobots, so to say. There are moments where the world is united against machines. But it's at least in this world an important venue for humans to come together to define the future.
Very important. And it's in the books.
Yes.
Which we like at the library. This is good.
And I hope you have them here. So now a little bit of an incentive maybe to at least pick those that have the UN in there.
I shall look into that. As we're getting to the end now, I was wondering, what gives you hope about the capacity of multilateralism to adapt and thrive in this era that's shaped by AI and so much technological change?
Well, thanks, Emmy, for keeping the most difficult question for last and the most political one. Look, what gives me hope on a daily basis is, and I sound like an old grandpa here, that we have been through all of this. We have been through difficult times. And just for my own biography, I'm East German. So I've seen different parts of my life like go into different turns. Or just take the pandemic. I think that most of our audience that is, listening in here has been through where we didn't know really the next week or the next day, and so we will go through this, right? Through the many wars, the uncertainty and so forth. And I think it's just the mindset we need to kind of choose, either to be skeptical and fearful and cave in, or to be creative and think about potential solutions that can help us thrive, right? So it's really this choice and this mindset that is important at that point.
Absolutely. Let's hope we choose the creativity. So finally, would you like to recommend a science fiction book or film that every diplomat and staff member should read or watch?
Very good. And I will be off-brand because I have to admit that I'm struggling with finding enough time to read science fiction at the moment, but I'm consuming audiovisual content, to call it technically here for the library in that vein. I've been nearly through kind of the last Star Wars series. I'm not going to say too much about this, but this is basically, maybe some of you have seen this. This is basically about a rebel that joins the revolution in order to fight the empire. And what we learn in here is kind of this imbalance of power that is present in the future, good and bad, but like the outliers that try to shift the needle. I'm a big fan of Dune, the books. Oh, in that regard, maybe, if you haven't read Dune, I think that's kind of really recommendable. And if you watch the movies, we have the second movie out, I think last year, a lot of elements are missing, but this is really about kind of our relation to nature also. And what do we do to push against injustice? Right? Like issues that are, and what's the element of force in there? So when is it legitimate to use force? Like questions that are currently relevant in the context of Palestine, in the context of Ukraine as well. What are the limits, right? And the UN Charter plays a role in that. Not in the movie, but like in that thinking. So those would be my suggestions. But, and if you are really curious about the UN in the science fiction context, you have to watch The Expanse. I think it's on Amazon Prime and probably they have it released on others, which is Earth, Mars, outer belt. So those are the three areas. And the Earth is governed by the United Nations or kind of a resemblance of that. So you see a lot of kind of UN symbols in that context and there are diplomatic negotiations going on and so forth. So I think that's a helpful one to just rediscover certain elements that you might deal with in your daily life as well. So the Expanse I highly recommend as well.
I'm curious to find out more. Martin Wählisch, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think you have maybe converted me to science fiction.
Beautiful. Amazing. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.